Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rob. Let's draw Loki. To start with, I know that in this composition I want to have Loki's helmet completely visible. It's really distinctive and it's kind of a trademark of the character. So, knowing this, however, I'm going to have to be careful with the composition because Loki's helmet has those extremely long horns, and that could serve to unbalance the composition overall. So, my first idea is to have a relatively simple setup, just Loki standing at 3/4 holding his staff, and then have the horns of his helmet sweeping up into the corner of the image. Now, trying this out, just doing my initial sketching and guidelines, I already feel as if this might not work out. Thinking ahead to when I add in colors and more details, those horns are going to be golden and they're going to draw the eye. Curved lines in a composition will lead an eye, not as much as a straight line, but it will still pull the attention. So, imagining a viewer when they first lay eyes on this piece, what they'll see is Loki's face. People gravitate toward faces first, but then their eye will be led up in a sweep into the top left corner of the image because of those horns. The idea with the staff is to draw the eye back down. But that really just means then that the viewer is going to scan from Loki's face up and then around the periphery of the image. They may or may not be led back to the center and really catch any of the details in his costume. At this point, I'm thinking, well, maybe that problem can be solved with interesting lighting. I can use light and shadow to help guide the eye back around and keep it in a loop all around the page. But as I sketch more and more detail, as I flesh out the image and get it closer to what it would actually be, I get the feeling that no, this composition's not strong enough, it won't hold up. It's good for getting the details of Loki's costume visible. You can see the intricate leather work, things like that, but as an overall composition, it's a little bit weak. So playing around with it, still mulling it over and thinking, I finally decide, no, this doesn't really work for me. So eventually I get an overall pose that I'm happy with, good elements. I have Loki's staff in his opposite hand and very close to the camera, good foreshortening on it, things like that. That will draw the eye back into the page because it's a straight line somewhat near the edge of the horns on this helmet. So as the viewer's gaze gets led up, it'll be brought back down with the staff, and then the face will draw attention again, so it's a constant loop around the page. But I don't have to worry about these foreground elements, his hand and his staff, pulling too much attention away, because I'm going to, at this point I've already decided that that'll be out of focus. So it'll be blurred and it won't pull as much detail. It won't pull as much of the viewer's attention. The fact that it's there will, but it won't have the sort of detail to cause the eye to linger. That detail will appear in Loki's face. So again, we've got a much stronger composition now because the eye is being led in a circle around and around the page, always back. Keeps it pleasing. So at this point, now that I've got the composition solidified, I'm filling in flats and adding in quite a few gradients just to help speed up the process of adding lighting and shading to the basic colors. Because I know I want really dramatic lighting, really strong contrast between light and shadow, highlight and darkness, so I'm I'm using the gradient tool to just very quickly throw all of that down to get a nice subtle transition in the parts where a subtle transition makes sense. So now, having finished all of my basic gradients, I've added in another layer, and I'm just doing my normal shadowing job. Using a soft brush. Don't want to use a hard brush for your shadows. A hard shadow could be easily added in later, or done with the lasso tool. And now I'm adding in highlights. The highlights could be done on a screen layer or a soft light layer, but personally I just like to do it on a normal layer using a soft brush, just airbrushing it in. So now that I've got everything in place, flatten it down and begin painting my forms, getting in all the shapes, cleaning up. Basically, this is the standard rendering form stage. Now, when you're rendering metals, especially highly reflective, shiny metals, there's a few things that you have to keep in mind. First off is that the metal, even if it's if it's slightly shiny, if it's painted over, things like that, it's still going to reflect its environment. Now, the shiniest metals would obviously look like a mirror. It would reflect the environment 100%. The duller that a metal is, the less accurate this reflection is. The blurrier this reflection is, essentially. But it's still reflecting the environment. So when you're painting a metal, you don't just want to worry about the direct lighting that falls on it. You don't want to just worry about lighting and shadow in that sense. You also want to think about the lights that are cast from reflected things. So you can see here, I'm already adding in details like the reflected blue light from Loki's staff. The metal will act like a mirror, so it's important that you consider this sort of thing. And really, this sort of thinking should come into play with all surfaces because, as I mentioned previously, every object that receives light could potentially itself act as a light source. So that's the basic idea behind global illuminance. You've got, like, if I have a character standing next to a painted wall, this wall is red, say, then the side of the character that is closest to that wall will be cast in a red light. This is the light that's bouncing off of that wall. So the same thing kind of comes into play here, but it's especially noticeable on metallic surfaces, on shiny metallic surfaces. So like with Loki's helmet, parts of the staff, the light from the staff is going to be reflecting in a very hard highlight, but also you'll have bits where maybe his green, what would you call that, shirt, cloak? The collar, the cloth collar reflects onto the bottom of the helmet, so there's a subtle green that I put in there with a soft brush. The parts not directly facing the light of the helmet will also have a subtle transition to darkness, sort of like it's reflecting the color from the environment, which is just a muddied gray and slightly brown, transitioning back into the highlight. So like you can see there on the left side of Loki's helmet, we've got the highlight, there's a streak of the darker color, sort of coppery, and then it goes back into highlight again, and then back into copper. That sort of transition, that light transition there, is a good indicator. It's a key that people naturally look for with metals, because in the real world, yeah, you would have to consider everything that's around this metal. You'd have to think about how the reflection works, things like that. But it's a painting, so it doesn't have to be completely physically accurate. All you want are the indicators. And typically the easiest way to indicate this is to have a few abstract shapes that are slightly darker than the normal color of the metal. So when you're drawing any kind of reflective metal, you just want to you can do it basically in 3 basic steps. You first lay down the overall color of the metal, or if it's highly reflective, the overall color of the environment, sort of like you do with the whites of the eyes. Then you lay in light shades of a much darker color to sort of indicate these ambiguous shapes that are being reflected in the environment. Then the final step is to go back through with your highlights and create a specular reflection. It could be the color of the strongest light source, or it could just simply be white. And like right here on the staff, you can kind of see where I'm doing this already. I've used blue for just to give the white specular a little bit of real punch, real highlight. But that's all it is. It's 3 basic indications, 3 basic passes that I do, and it gives the metal the feeling of metal. As long as you keep in mind the actual contour, the actual shape of the surface that you're painting, you have a little bit of leeway with the lighting. You can play around with it, and it doesn't have to be 200% accurate. And so here, I'm cleaning it up, making sure that I've gotten all, or at least most of my initial sketch hidden, painted over. Trying to add in small details on the parts that I'm going to shift out of focus, so that once I do apply the Gaussian blur, the detail spreads out organically. Now there I felt like that section was a little too dark, so I punched it up a little bit with a bit of distance fogging, just a gradient tool. Now here on this helmet, you can see I'm adding in the final step, the white highlights. It doesn't always have to be white, but light is usually white for most situations and most things that you're painting, so it's a safe bet that your specular highlight will be white. If the scene had only a predominantly, like, I don't know, green light, red light, whatever, that would be the color of the specular highlight. That hot spot that I've painted white here would actually be red or green, something like that. So now I'm adding in light diffusion, simulate having a camera lens, then I blur. You want to make sure you get as many of those smaller details in as possible before you do a Gaussian blur to indicate which parts are in focus or out, because adding in those effects later, especially after this step, is extremely difficult. So now I just erase away parts of the layer that I want in focus. And I've decided that the focal plane will be Loki's face. So everything in the middle of the torso will be in focus. Everything behind or in front of that will be out of focus. Now here I'm adding in highlights that are referred to in photography as bokeh. I don't want to make them too strong though, I just want the subtle indication. So I don't want to pull away from the composition. I don't want attention to be drawn too much away from Loki's face. The entire idea of the foreground elements is to lead the eye down and then back up and around. So there, subtle details indicate energy coming off of Loki's staff, just to add a bit of visual interest. And now I adjust the levels. So we went a little too bright. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen.